Today we are talking about the real reason that God flooded the earth as we continue to explore the banned gospel of the Egyptians. But not only are we going to take a look at the flood, but we're going to be taking a look at Sodom and Gomorrah, the Tower of Babel, and even elements of the book of Enoch to see how all of this is representative of a war on consciousness that is going on to this day. So we're continuing to look at the banned gospel of the Egyptians. If you haven't seen the other parts, that's okay. You don't need to understand this. However, if you do enjoy what I talk about, I highly recommend that you do check out the other videos in this playlist. Also, as a reminder, please like and subscribe so that we can spread this information. And if you ever feel like you've learned something or gotten something from my work, consider supporting on Patreon. You'll get access to secret videos, secret live streams. Helps out a lot. That is the best way to support my work and what I do here on my channel. So, we are taking a look and seeing that the way that the flood is described in the Egyptian book, the Egyptian gospel, is completely different than in mainstream Christianity, and we're going to see that it's symbolic for something completely different as we explore this truth here. So let's just jump right into it because there's a lot to talk about. There's so much to talk about, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to get through all these different elements. And this is stuff that you really need to know with regard to even what's going on today and this state of, because if you look around today, you can see a battle between the unconscious masses versus a humanity that is becoming more and more conscious. And this is exactly what we're going to discover in the meaning of the flood and the Tower of Babel and so much more. So let's pull this up right away. So this is reading again from the banned gospel of the Egyptians, and this is a Gnostic text, and you can read this for free on gnosis.org. Now, it says, "Then the great Seth came and brought his seed, and it was sown in the..." Oh, by the way, if my voice sounds a little hoarse, it's because I'm a little sick. So bear with me there. If it's a little scratchy, I'm sorry, but what can you do? So anyway, "Then the great Seth came forth and brought his seed, and it was sown in the eons which had been brought forth, their number being the amount of Sodom. Some say that Sodom is the place of pasture of the great Seth, which is Gomorrah, but others say that the great Seth took his plant out of Gomorrah and planted it in the second place, to which he gave the name Sodom." Okay, so what is being discussed here? And you, again, bear with me as I have to take some drinks because my throat is a little sore. So if you're just joining us, you might be wondering, what the heck are we talking about? Let me give you a quick recap. Adam and Eve gave birth to children. You're probably familiar with Cain and Abel. Well, Seth is the third son of Adam and Eve. Now, Seth represents sort of the true union of Adam and Eve, because in Gnosticism, Cain and Abel are the illegitimate sons. Cain and Abel came from the sexual assault of Eve by the evil creator God, by God. And so Seth represents the true unification of Adam and Eve. Now remember, Adam and Eve are symbolic for two parts of humanity that were split apart. That is, Adam represents the mind, and Eve represents epinoia, or conceptual thought. So the evil creator God, the God of what would be the Bible, who is called in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, not Book of the Dead, in the banned Gospel of the Egyptians, is called Sakla. What he did to enslave humanity is split humanity into two parts, representative by Adam and Eve, but this is the mind and conceptual thought. So Seth, being the true child or union of Adam and Eve, represents the union of mind and conceptual thought, meaning the ability to have self-knowledge, self-awareness, true understanding of what one is. So Seth represents the ability to have self-knowledge. Now, the creator God, Sakla, does not want this. He wants humanity to remain in ignorance to what they are. He wants them to think that he is God and to think that they are lesser, broken, flawed humans that must worship him. When in truth, we are all divine. We are all divine beings, and self-knowledge allows us to realize that that is not the true God. We are the true God, and we can transcend. So Seth represents the ability to have self purposeful thinking, have self-knowledge. So when it says Seth brought his seed, that means Seth and all of Seth's descendants. So Seth and Seth's descendants represent, metaphorically, the population, those humans that have the ability to reach enlightenment. Those humans who have the ability to reach a higher consciousness. That is what Seth and his seed represent. Remember, all these stories are symbols, codes, and metaphors. So that's what Seth and his seed represents. And remember that Jesus Christ is a descendant of Seth. So Jesus Christ represents another human who had the ability to reach enlightenment and was trying to teach humanity how they can reach a higher consciousness as well. Now, according to the Gospel of the Egyptians, Jesus Christ is an avatar or an incarnation of Seth. Again, this is just another metaphor for talking about how Christ, Seth, all these people had the ability to reach a higher consciousness and wanted humanity to wake up and reach a higher consciousness. So now you see that Seth is now related to being in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah is, in the Bible, said that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because they were sinning against God. Now this is going to be really important, okay? Because as we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and the flood and the Tower of Babel, all of these places were destroyed or their plans were disrupted by God because, according to the Bible, they had become sinful. But as we're going to see, there's something else going on here. So it's important to see that in this Gospel of the Egyptians, those who had self-knowledge and higher consciousness are associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, a place that God, Sakla, the evil creator being, destroyed. Now, just as a note here, I want to say, this isn't really relevant, but kind of interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah is where we get the word sodomy from. And it's possible, and this is just me kind of speculating, is that the Sethian Gnostics were against sex and procreation. They were against procreation because they believed that bringing humans into the world was wrong. Giving birth. They were anti-natalists. They believed that giving birth was wrong because they thought that they were just creating more prisons, more bodies for souls to be trapped in. So I kind of speculate, I wonder if they were into sodomy. Because if you were into sodomy, you'd be able to engage in intercourse without giving birth. I don't know if that's true, but it's just interesting to speculate if that is possibly the case. But anyway, that really doesn't have any relevance to what we're talking about, but kind of an interesting aside. Anyway, as I was saying, so you'll notice that Seth is associated with, and his seed are associated with, this place that God destroyed because God said that they were being sinful. Now, but let's continue here, and we're going to see there's a lot more to this. And then it says, and the flood came as an example for the consummation of the eon, but it will be sent into the world because of this race. A conflagration will come upon the earth, and grace will be with those who belong to the race, through the prophets and the guardians who guard the life of the race. Because of this race, famines will occur and plagues, but these things will happen because of the great incorruptible race. Because of this race, temptations will come, a falsehood of false prophets. So, real quick, well, let me just read a little more. Then the great Seth saw the activity of the devil and his many guises and his schemes, which will come upon Seth's incorruptible, immovable race, and the persecutions of his powers and his angels and their error, and they acted against themselves. So there's a couple things that we need to untangle here. First of all, I want to point out, when they're saying race, they don't mean it in the way that we understand that word today. They're talking about just everyone associated with Seth. They're talking about this in terms of that when they say Seth's race or the incorruptible race or the perfect race, what they're talking about is the human beings who have self-knowledge and can achieve a higher consciousness. That, remember, all this is metaphorical. So they're not talking about like a literal genetic thing or anything like that. They're talking about those humans who have the capacity or have done the work to look within and have self-knowledge. Because remember, all this is a metaphor. So that's one thing to understand. Now, also to understand where it says when the great Seth saw the activity of the devil and his many guises and his schemes, which will come upon Seth's seed. By the devil, he means the God of the Bible. They look at the God of the Bible as being the devil, the entity called Sakla or Yaldabaoth. Sakla means fool. So Sakla has fooled the world into thinking that it's God. So basically, you have to see what Sakla, or the God of the Bible, is trying to do is trying to keep humanity in an unconscious state. That's why he split the soul or the being into separate beings, Adam and Eve. He separated mind from conceptual thought. But that didn't work because they eventually gave birth to Seth, who was the unification of that. Now remember, this is all metaphorical, of course, but you can see that that was one of the ways that God tried to, or Sakla, or the devil, tried to stop humanity from being conscious. Another one was by putting them in the Garden of Eden, which was a low form of consciousness, and making the fruit of knowledge forbidden, but eventually they ate from the fruit and they gained knowledge and were able to break out of the Garden of Eden. And so you can see that at every turn, Sakla and his schemes are being defeated. Seth establishes his home with his children and those who can reach a higher consciousness in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. So now we come to the idea of the flood, because the flood is another time that God destroys the entirety of the world, basically, except for Noah and his family. Well, according to Gnosticism, especially if you look at books like and remember that this is a Gnostic gospel, the gospel of the Egyptians. If you look at the gospel called the Apocalypse of Adam, I have a whole playlist on the Apocalypse of Adam. Check that out on my channel if you want to know all about this. It talks about how Adam and Eve were split into two, and it talks more about Seth, and it talks about Noah and the flood and all that. So what's revealed is that when it says that God destroyed the world with a flood because humans were being sinful, it's not that they were being sinful. It was because of Seth and everyone and Seth's descendants, that they were waking up, becoming self-aware, and realizing that they were divine, and realizing that God wasn't God at all, that he was an evil entity, so they weren't worshiping him. So, in other words, God didn't destroy the world with a flood because they were becoming sinful. According to the Gnostics, God destroyed the world with a flood because humanity was becoming too intelligent and too self-aware and refused to be the slaves and worshipers of this God. So how can we understand this? And I want to say as well that this isn't just in the Gnostic texts, but if we look at the book of Enoch as well, the book of the Watchers, in the book of Enoch, it tells about how the Watchers came and started teaching humanity about science, about self-expression, about makeup, about art, about sexual freedom. And because they were learning all these things about the movements of the stars and science and expression and makeup, etc., this is in the book of Enoch. This is why God sent a flood, because humanity was becoming too intelligent. And so if we look at these books that were banned, a common theme, book of Enoch, and in these Gnostic texts, that God destroyed humanity because they were becoming too smart. And remember that this is all metaphorical as well. So what happens? Because you remember that in the story of the flood, God sends a flood. He covers the earth in water, and he destroys everyone except for Noah and his family. So what's going on here? Well, in Gnosticism, we discover that Seth and his descendants, or at least the descendants of Seth, are actually saved. They aren't drowned by the flood. How are they saved? They are saved by being taken up in a cloud of light. Okay, a lot of really interesting things to unpack here. So, first of all, the flood and covering the earth with waters is the ocean is very, very often an archetypal symbol for the unconscious. Have you ever heard of like the dark waters of the unconscious? If you even look at like the iceberg photo when it describes consciousness versus the unconscious, it shows the tip of the iceberg is that which is above the water, that's consciousness, and then the huge portion of the iceberg that's underneath the water, that's the unconscious portion. So being underneath the water is a very extremely common archetypal symbol for the unconscious. So Sakla, Yaldabaoth, the evil creator god, wants to keep humanity in a state of unconsciousness. So floods the world with unconsciousness. But what happens to Seth? Or at least what happens to the descendants of Seth, those that have the power of conceptual thought and self-knowledge? Do they succumb to being buried deep within the waters of the unconscious? Do they become unconscious? No, they get taken up into a cloud of light. They reach higher consciousness. You see the huge difference between underneath the dark waters of the unconscious versus being taken up into a cloud of light. They don't go down into the dark unconscious, they go higher up into the light of consciousness. So you can see all these metaphors taking place for a war on consciousness that is occurring between the forces of the unconscious and the forces of consciousness, or the forces of the world that want humanity to remain in ignorance and easily controlled, and those who want humanity to become enlightened and reach the pinnacles of light, to reach the clouds of light, to reach a higher consciousness. Now, we can see that God saved Noah and his family, and if we look at books like the Apocalypse of Adam, and we can see that the reason why is revealed, it's because Noah and his family still worship the creator God, still worship Sakla, still worship Yaldabaoth. And Sakla makes a deal with Noah. Sakla basically says, hey, if you and your descendants promise to be my slaves, I will make you kings of the earth. And Noah says, okay, let's do it. And so Noah agrees that he and his descendants will always be slaves to Sakla, and they will become kings of the earth. So what does this represent? Well, now we have the descendants of Noah versus the descendants of Seth. Because remember, Noah doesn't die. Noah gets saved in the ark, but the descendants of Seth don't die either. They get taken up in a cloud of light. So now on earth, we have the descendants of Noah versus the descendants of Seth. And these are the forces of the unconscious versus the forces of consciousness. But what happens? Noah's family and Noah's descendants become kings of the earth. What does that mean? That means that those who rule the world, the controllers of the world, that you can think of them as the rich elites or whoever you want to think of them as, those who are in charge are those, descendants of Noah, metaphorically, meaning they want to keep humanity in ignorance and they want humanity to be easily controlled. So today we are still fighting that war, that mental war that is being discussed here in the form of the descendants of Noah who rule the world versus the descendants of Seth who have the power of self-knowledge and can reach higher states of consciousness and higher states of knowing. So you have this war of consciousness versus the unconsciousness, of ignorance versus knowledge, metaphorically being discussed here and in the flood and the descendants of Seth. Now, I want to, let's see, talk a little bit about the Tower of Babel with regard to this. Now, the Tower of Babel is not explicitly mentioned in the Gospel of the Egyptians. It's not mentioned in here, but I just want to point your attention to it. Having this knowledge of what we have learned from the Gospel of the Egyptians and the different Gnostic Gospels and understanding these metaphors and how this works, I want you to think about the Tower of Babel. If you're not familiar with the Tower of Babel, I'll give you a quick rundown. Now, this is a story that's found in the Bible. This is the Tower of Babel is a story found in the Bible, and basically it goes like this. Humanity is coming together to work on this tower, and they are building an extremely tall tower. And why are they doing this? Well, in the Bible it says they are attempting to build a tower to heaven. Now that might sound kind of crazy, like, well, you can't build a tower to heaven. That's crazy. Well, what does God say? God says that they can do it. God says that basically when humans come together, they can do anything that they put their mind to, and that they would be able to do it. So what does God do? God, to stop them from accomplishing their goal of humanity uniting and building a tower to heaven, God confuses them by making them all speak in different languages so that they can't work together. Now, often in Christianity, they go, well, this is the origin of why different languages exist, because God made everyone speak a different language in the Tower of Babel. Yeah, that's stupid. But there's a deeper metaphor going on here, because it should sound kind of strange to you. Obviously, you can't literally build a tower up to heaven. Well, that's because this is all a metaphor. Remember, all this stuff is symbols. All this stuff are metaphors. So the idea here is that if humanity comes together and works together and unite, builds a tower, remember, going higher is a metaphor for reaching a higher consciousness, it will be able to reach the kingdom of God. In other words, humanity will be able to establish the kingdom of God and reach a higher consciousness through its cooperation. That's what we talk about all the time here, is that when humanity comes together and cooperates, we can build a planetary civilization, which is a connected and united world where we will be able to finally be working together to create a thriving world rather than a world about survival, a world where we're celebrating our diversity instead of hating each other, a world where we're increasing the quality of life for every individual in the collective, a world where we're no longer fighting over money and whose God is the right God and all that bullshit, but instead are creating a world where we can have thriving and meaningful experiences together. So essentially what the Tower of Babel represents is humanity's ability to come together, reach a higher consciousness, and quote unquote, reach heaven, establish a beautiful grand society. And God says, nope, I'm not cool with that. I don't want that to happen. So what does he do? He keeps them divided and fractured. And that's his representative of making them all confused and speaking different languages. Well, you can see that metaphor holds today, where we look at why is humanity not cooperating? Well, because it's not united. It's fractured. Everyone thinks that their nation is the best nation, or their culture is the best culture, or their race is the best race, or their gender is the best gender, or whatever. Like, on every front, humanity is just constantly divided and fighting with each other. So what? They can't reach a higher consciousness. They can't establish a grand society. Instead, we have the hellish world that we have now. And we can see that reflected in the Tower of Babel, where God stops humanity from uniting and reaching their grand project of a higher consciousness and establishing, reaching the kingdom of heaven, by keeping them fractured and divided. So you're going to see at every turn, God, aka Sakla, aka Yaldabaoth, this evil entity, is constantly trying to keep humanity buried underneath the waters of the unconscious, fractured, divided, and far away from reaching an understanding of what they are, who they are, where they are, why they're here. And we today, this is continuing through that metaphorical battle between the descendants of Noah and the descendants of Seth. Of course, this is metaphorical, not literal, meaning the forces of those who control the world, the kings of the world, the rulers of the world, who want to keep humanity in ignorance and easily controlled, versus those who want to liberate humanity and reach a higher consciousness. And of course, we are those who want to liberate humanity and reach a higher consciousness. We want the entirety of humanity to reach a higher consciousness, regardless of sex, age, race, gender, any of that. All of us are one and united and should be celebrating our diversity and creating a better world together in equality and in equity. Now, I'm getting a little carried away here. There's a bit more that I want to talk about. This is very important. It says, then the great Seth gave praise to the great uncallable virginal spirit and the male virgin Babylon, and the three male child, Seth, the power which really truly lives, and the male virgin, Yoel, and Espech, the holder of glory and the crown of his glory, and the great Doxamedon Eon, and the thrones which are in him, and the powers which surround them, and the whole pleroma, as I mentioned before, and he asked for guards over his seed. All right, so what does all this mean? All this really means, remember, this is all metaphorical and whatnot. Here, Seth is giving praise to the true realm of divine light and all the eons or angelic beings that exist there. What this is metaphorical for is Seth emphasizing the power of mind and consciousness, because the pleroma, the realm of divine light, and all the entities that exist there are representative of higher thought, higher consciousness, and higher modes of thinking. And he says that, and he asked for guards over his seed. This is just more and more emphasizing the idea that Seth contains this power of purposeful thought, of higher thinking, of higher consciousness, and he wants this higher consciousness to continue throughout his descendants. Then there came forth from the great eons 400 ethereal angels accompanied by the great Erosiel and the great Selmechel to guard the great incorruptible race, its fruit, and the great men of the great Seth. And when it says fruit, it just means what they are able to produce. So when you hear the word fruit in the Bible or in these texts, fruit is just the product of someone. So when it says about Seth and his fruit, that means Seth and what he is able to do, the things that he is able to do, the things that he is able to bring to the world. And from the time and the moment of truth and justice until the consummation of the eon and its archons, those whom the great judges have condemned to death. Then the great Seth was sent by the four lights, by the will of the autogenes, and the whole pleroma, through the gift and the good pleasure of the great invisible spirit, and the five seals and the whole pleroma. So this is again just emphasizing that Seth is being guided by higher consciousness, and the great invisible spirit is the one mind of existence. So this is all in accordance with higher consciousness and the one mind of existence and the light of knowledge. This is just continuing to emphasize that being guided by higher consciousness. Seth passed through the three judgments, which I mentioned before: the flood, the conflagration, and the judgment of the archons and the powers and the authorities, to save her who went astray through the reconciliation of the world, and the baptism through a logos begotten body, which the great Seth prepared for himself secretly through the Virgin, in order that the saints may be begotten by the Holy Spirit through invisible secret symbols, through a reconciliation of the world with the world, through the renouncing of the world and the God of the 13 eons, and through the convocations of the saints and ineffable ones, through the incorruptible bosom and through the great light of the Father, who pre-existed with his providence and established through her the holy baptism that surpasses the heaven, through the incorruptible Logos begotten one, even Jesus the living one, even whom he, the great Seth, has put on, and through him he nailed the powers of the 13 eons and established those who are brought forth and taken away. He armed them with an armor of knowledge of this truth and an unconquerable power of incorruptibility. So what this is just emphasizing here is, again, much of the same, in that Seth is coming with the knowledge of the world, and just sort of like how Sakla is doing everything in his power to keep the world divided, keep it corrupted, establishing the seed of Noah, trying to keep the humanity unconscious. This is just emphasizing everything that Seth is doing to bring the light of the world, or not the light of the world, the light of the pleroma, the light of higher consciousness to earth. Talking about Jesus Christ coming to teach people how they can reach a higher consciousness. And in this, they are saying that Jesus Christ is actually an incarnation of Seth, that Christ is Seth incarnated. And remember, in the Gnostic version of Christ, Christ is not someone to worship or have faith in or anything like that. Christ is someone who comes to teach you how you can become divine, know yourself, and become God yourself. So this is another emphasis on, just like Sakla is doing all these things to divide the world, Seth is doing all these things to give the world the power that it can to have knowledge of itself. And one of those is the emissary of Christ, to attempt to teach the world that it can become divine itself by looking within, by finding the light, the higher consciousness within itself. So we can see, again, it's important to understand. Remember, this is something that a lot of newcomers to my channel miss, is that all this stuff are metaphors. It's the battle of the ignorance versus the battle of knowledge and consciousness. And this is seen through the metaphor of the flood, flooding the world with unconsciousness. We can see this in tearing the world apart in the story of the Tower of Babel. And we can see this with the descendants of Noah being the rulers of the world, who made a pact to be slaves of ignorance, basically. And now we exist in the world as those of a higher consciousness who are in a world where the rulers are trying to keep humanity in a state of ignorance, in a state of darkness. But together, we can shine the light of consciousness on this world and create a new world and establish the kingdom of heaven right here and right now, and overcome the forces of ignorance and darkness. Because when we are united, we can do everything. We can do anything. And that's why, like in the story of the Tower of Babel, God keeps trying to attempt to divide humanity. We must come together. We must work together. We must be united, because when we are united, we can reach the divine. That's the important thing to remember. And by reaching the divine, that is unlocking the power of consciousness within us and being able to create a world reflected of the knowledge of what we are, where we are, and why we are here. Now, there is still more to the Gospel of the Egyptians, which we are going to explore next week. And if you haven't seen the other videos, explore those. They're in this playlist. I have so many more. All the things we talked about, the apocalypse of Adam, all the different Sethian texts, like the Secret Book of John, they're all playlists on my channel. Go watch them. Go check them out if you enjoyed this sort of thing. Make sure you like and subscribe. And once again, if you enjoy my work, if you feel like you've learned something, support on Patreon. It's what allows me to continue to create and spread this information. You'll get access to secret videos and a lot more. I really appreciate it. I want to shout out to everyone who does support on Patreon. I do have to update this. I will update this soon. There's new names I have to add to this. So if your name isn't up there yet, don't worry. I will get to you. But thanks to Philanthropist, Zach, Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Michael, Angela, Maria, Top of the World, Ethan, Joel, It's Fashida, and everyone else. You can also support by hitting the join button on YouTube right below this video.